Shares of Iridium Communications higher today after getting a contract from L3Harris to provide services to the FAA. That adds Iridium to a list of companies which is depending on L3Harris, which is in turn depending on the U.S. government for funding. Emily Wilkins is live from a radio communications facility in Rochester, New York. Emily.
Hey, Tyler. Well, yeah, we are here in L3Harris, where they create and build these military tactical communication radios that are used on the front lines in Ukraine. This facility, it's got about 4,000 employees here in Rochester, and they've gotten about several $100 million in federal funding since the Ukraine-Russia war began. But of course, that federal funding has now run out. And Congress is struggling on whether or not they should be passing another $60 billion in funding for Ukraine. L3Harris's president of communication systems, Sam Mehta, said that the delays have led to complications in the economy and in how the company functions. He says that it's not only impacted this facility here, but it's had an impact on this facility's 470 suppliers, many of which are small and mid-sized businesses.
It will cause them to make some very, very tough decisions about employment. It'll cause them to have tough decisions about whether or not they can reinvest in capital, in capacity. We've also heard from them that it's created a little bit of concern about whether or not they even want to continue to be in the defense industry with this amount of unpredictability.
At this point, about 61% of all funding that Congress has approved for Ukraine has actually gone to U.S. companies like this one here. Still, there is a lot of opposition in Congress, particularly among Republicans, to passing any more funding. Still, House Speaker Mike Johnson says he wants to find a way to get additional aid to Ukraine. It's just a matter of how, and he's going to be trying to figure out exactly how to get his Republican colleagues on board. They return to Congress tonight after a 2-week break. And guys, this is one of the top priorities. We're expecting to hear a lot more in the next 2 weeks about how they plan to get this done.
You said they have how many employees there, and how many of them are directly tied to work on Ukraine?
Well, it's about 4,000 employees. I mean, they create these radios here that are used for Ukraine, but they also create radios that are used in the U.S. And actually, some of the technology that they send to Ukraine, they get feedback from Ukrainians, and they're able to further develop the U.S. product based off of that. We do know that this facility did ramp up the number of employees that it had when the war in Ukraine began, and some of that federal funding began coming in. It's a little difficult to say exactly how many since they have various customers, but Sam Mehta did tell me that a lot of the contractors, they call him up and they say, hey, what's going on with this federal funding? We need to know, we need to plan, and that could impact a lot of the employees for the contractors down the line. There's really a big supply chain element here to this story.
Emily Wilkins, thanks for bringing us that story.
Welcome back. The battle for funding for Ukraine is heating up on Capitol Hill, but it's not just Ukraine that's being impacted by that fight. Emily Wilkins looks at one U.S. defense contractor with a lot at stake.
Hey, Morgan. Well, we are here in Rochester at L3Harris's production facility that makes these tactical communications radios. You can actually see some workers here putting some finishing touches on some of these radios. And this facility, it's 4,000 employees, and it's gotten several $100 million since the war in Ukraine began and the U.S. began giving that federal funding. It's really not uncommon. Of the more than $100 billion in federal funding for Ukraine aid that Congress has put forward, more than half of that has gone to U.S. companies. And so even though there are still a lot of questions about what the future of the funding is going to be, that money has now run out. And so Congress is looking at passing another chunk of funding, but that is running into political pressure. I spoke today with L3Harris's president of communication systems, Sam Mehta. He says he often gets calls from his 470 suppliers about what's going to happen with Congress. It's going to impact a lot of those small to medium-sized businesses. Listen to what he had to say.
We have hundreds of small and medium-sized businesses that rely upon funding, predictability, and the continuity of the funding so that they can plan their employment, their operations, and their capacity. This is critical for them.
Now, the Senate has already passed $60 billion in aid for Ukraine. It now goes to the House. And you just heard this afternoon Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell say that he wants Speaker Mike Johnson to put that bill on the floor. That's going to be tough for Johnson to do. A near majority of Republicans in the House have some sort of opposition to additional Ukraine funding. So Johnson's trying to find a path forward. Now, that could be having some of the funding as a loan. It could mean having some of the funding taken from seized Russian assets. Congress gets back from a 2-week recess tonight, and Ukraine funding is near the top of the list. We're really interested and going to be following exactly those conversations between House Republicans on how to potentially get this Ukraine aid done. Morgan?
I mean, what's so key about this is the fact that when you talk about the supplemental funding, whether it's Ukraine or some of the other countries that have been in focus as well, is so much of the funding that's allocated is specifically for the U.S. defense industrial base to replenish stockpiles that have already gone out in light of these different conflicts. I wonder if this is just suffering from a marketing issue and perhaps just needs to be repackaged as such.
I mean, Morgan, it is talked about as Ukraine aid, Ukraine aid, Ukraine aid. It's not really talked about as, funding that is actually going to U.S. companies to replenish some of those supplies. And it was interesting when I was talking with Sam Mehta today, he mentioned the fact that stuff like this is out in the field in Ukraine. It's actually helping the U.S. technology because they get feedback from the Ukrainian front lines on what's working, what's not, and they're able to integrate that not into their technology going to Ukraine, but also to the technology that the U.S. military uses. And you've seen reports from groups like the American Enterprise Institute noting that there have been some supply chains that have really gone dormant in past years that are now back up and running because aid is going to Ukraine for a land war. It really has revitalized a number of jobs here in the U.S., but it's a question of what the future looks like with some of the political opposition.
Yeah, it also speaks to the billions of dollars, to your point, that we've seen go back into ramping production for things like missiles and munitions as well. Emily Wilkins, great reporting.
And they're kicking off yet another battle over a multi-billion-dollar aid package for Ukraine, potentially stifling billions in funding for U.S. defense companies. Emily Wilkins went to one of these companies, and she joins us now from upstate New York. Emily.
Hey, Brian. Well, in D.C., the debate about Ukraine funding is often about Ukraine, but it's actually U.S. companies like this L3Harris one in Rochester that's making tactical communication radios that have seen a bulk of the funding. Of the $113 billion that Congress has passed, 61% have stayed with U.S. companies. But the uncertainty as to whether Congress is going to pass additional funding is impacting the defense supply chain. L3Harris President for Communications Systems, Sam Mehta, told me he gets calls all the time from the 470 suppliers to this facility, and they're trying to figure out how to hire, whether to let go, whether to expand capital, and a lot of those decisions are going to depend on how Congress acts. Listen to what he told me today.
We have a significant amount of urgency. We're delivering out a lot of the last radios from the last supplemental bill. And so this new bill becomes very important for us and even more important for our supply base.
Now the House is back in session, and Speaker Mike Johnson has said it is a priority for him to try and find a way to get this Ukraine funding done, but that's going to be difficult with the politics and the fact that a lot of House Republicans don't want to see any additional funding. Brian?
Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, he's got to make this palatable to House Republicans. To your point, I mean, it's got to be agreed to by pretty much everybody. How do you do that?
So Johnson's got a couple different ideas here. Number one is giving the aid, but giving it as a loan. The other one is an act that's been out, a bill rather, that's been out there for a while, that would basically take Russian assets that were seized by the U.S. and use that funding to support Ukraine. There's also been discussion about adding conservative priorities to this legislation, like lifting that temporary pause on LNG exports. But we're going to get a lot more clarity now that lawmakers are actually back in D.C. and they can get into rooms with each other and chat on exactly what that's going to look like. And we're kind of expecting this plan to develop over this week, maybe into next week. But we did hear Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell call on Mike Johnson today, and he said, hey, look, Senate's already passed that $60 billion bill. Johnson needs to put that on the floor and give it a vote.
Emily Wilkins, Rochester, New York. Emily, appreciate it.